One of the ways that I have been quite fortunate in my life is in having three dads. And you might say, well, how is it possible to have three dads? And I'll tell you that story here. What I mean by that is I have three men who in one way or another were part of my life or are part of my life who did the things that are involved in fatherhood. Because fatherhood comprises a lot of different things. And I was fortunate, even though I only had with some of them a shorter time than I would like, in that time was quite good. So let me start by telling you at the start who I'm actually talking about. I have a biological father because I'm adopted. Well, everybody has a biological father, adopted or not. But I have somebody who I denote as my biological father. And he and I have had a relationship sort of building up over the last roughly 2 years. And that's really great. It's an important part of my life. We did miss out on a lot, and I'll talk about that when we get to discussing that a little bit later on. And I was adopted very, very young by the people that I think of as my parents, both of whom are dead. My mother died when she was 54, and I was just turning 30 that coming year. And my father died when I was 11, turning 12, when he was only 36. I've done another video talking about what that was like as well. So if you're interested in that, I'll put a link to it. And then there's another guy who I'm in contact with and get to see from time to time, who dated my mother and was sort of a surrogate father figure for me and was in and out of my life at various points. And it's it's a real blessing for me, in some respects, an undeserved one, that I still have two of these men in my life, and that I was able to make contact and all of that sort of stuff. So I have my biological father, who I think of as my father. I have my adoptive father, who I think of as my father. And then I have another, not legally adoptive, but kind of father figure, who I also think of as, certainly along the lines of a dad, somebody who had a formative influence on me, much for the better, as I was maturing into a young man. So those are, in order, Carl, Tony, and Fran. All three, very short names when you think about it. And so I'm going to talk first about my adoptive father and what he was like and why it was so great to have him around. And I have to mention, too, that, I'm now 46, so I've lived 10 years more than he ever lived. And he died when I was pretty young. But he did have a great influence on my life, for the better in many ways. So my adoptive dad, and I'm just going to call him my dad, Tony, he was an only child from a family, my grandfather Joseph and my grandmother Ann, who unfortunately also died somewhat young as well of cancer. He grew up in Arlington Heights, and he came up to Madison. He ended up meeting my mother, who was also from the Chicago area, Monique, while they were at school. And eventually she dropped out of the school that she was in, and came up and married him, and they lived in Madison. They found that they weren't able to have kids, so they decided to adopt, and they got into the queue, I suppose you would call it, with Catholic Social Services, and it took a lot of vetting and a lot of meetings, and from what I hear, about 2 years worth of processes and paperwork, and then they adopted me. And by that time, he had graduated, and he was in law school, and my father ended up becoming a tax attorney, which meant that he had a CPA and a law degree. He only went to court once, which was in Washington, D.C., because he had to fight a case for a company with the IRS. So we ended up doing a trip for about a week when I was 10 out to Washington, D.C., and he was in court much of the time, but we got to travel around a lot and spend time together. And my dad was an extremely hard worker. Being a tax attorney, especially at that time, meant that during tax season itself, he was driving here where we live in the downtown of Milwaukee now. We lived way out on the border of Wales and Delafield. You can look at a map and find out where that is. And that was about an hour drive in, given rush hour, and an hour drive out. So during tax season, he would get up before we were even up and make the drive in and drive back home very late. He also had to do quite a few business trips. Probably, I would say, once a month he had to be gone for several days, usually to Kansas City. When he was back, some of the, when he was doing the bills, we left him alone. That was something that he enjoyed, but was also aggravating. But he spent a lot of time of his available time with us kids. And that would be me and my sister, who is also adopted, but from a different family. And we did a lot of outdoorsy things. Eventually we bought a boat. For a long time, he and I would go fishing, and he'd wake me up early in the morning, and we'd go and rent a rowboat and row out into Lake Nagawicca and fish. I generally didn't know what I was doing. He was an exceptional fisherman who had taken a lot of trips and knew quite a bit of stuff. But he sort of let me do what I wanted to do. I often had some kind of silly notions about fishing. And I'll actually tell you one story about something that happened when we were fishing. So we had these beautiful enameled bait casting rods and reels, and we would go out, we would drive the boat once we had it to a place called the Kettle, which was almost like a little bay, full of weeds and great habitat for fish in Lake Nagawicca. And we would, cast with our bobbers, and sometimes we'd use wax worms, and sometimes it would be regular worms or minnows or hellgrammites and all sorts of cool stuff like that. Well, one time we only brought one rod, and I don't remember why we didn't pack it. So what we were doing is he would cast and he would hold it, and then if we got anything on, he would have me reel it in. So this is the first big fish that I ever caught, and the bobber went down and he hooked it and handed it to me, and I start reeling it in, and it's bending the rod, and it's pulling out line, and this is not something I was used to. I'd read about this sort of thing, but it never really happened, and so I finally reel it in. And it's this huge white bass that actually almost broke the state record. It came 1 ounce short of matching the state record. And my dad used to joke that we should have put some sinkers down his throat before he went and weighed it. And so we bring it in, and it was 3.5 pounds. But for a kid who I think I was maybe in 3rd or 4th grade, that's a pretty good-sized fish. So we drove across the lake and docked it. And he goes into the bar across the street and comes out, a couple minutes later, and he says it's this weight. So, we go, and it actually got into the paper, one of the local papers. It might have been the Waukesha Freeman or something along those lines. But he was very giving with his time. When he would come home from work late at night, he'd want to wrestle with us, or he would, we'd play games, and sometimes he would bring us a Kit Kat. That was the treat that I particularly liked, and my sister would get one too. And so, we did a lot of things together, a lot of camping, a lot of boating, a lot of fishing, and it was pretty good. We were supposed to move down to Houston because he had worked for a law firm here in Milwaukee for a long time, and then switched to another firm where he was the chief accountant. But he found they were cooking the books, so he decided to quit, and he wanted to go back to his old law firm. And they said, yeah, you can do that, but we need you to help open the new office down in Houston. So we were actually all set to move down to Houston. We were getting ready to do that when he got sick, and he ended up dying of what was labeled fever of unknown origin, which means that, even though he went to the Mayo Clinic, they never figured out what it was, and they tried a lot of different remedies, and he just was not improving, and eventually he died after about 4 months of sickness that was overt, but it sounded as if he probably knew that there was something wrong with him. As it turned out, he had 2 siblings who were stillborn. They were born dead, and another one that was born and died a month after birth. So there may have been something genetic that was just waiting to take him. And it was very tough, when he died. It was an age for me that I could have really used having a dad at that time. Adolescence is kind of rough. It was very tough on my sister. It was very tough on my mom. We had my dad's dad, my grandpa, living with us, and he was a pretty hardcore alcoholic. He went through, a lot of beer, a lot of wine, a lot of liquor every week. We just sort of took it for granted back then. And so, several years went on, and then another man came into our lives through dating my mom, and that was Fran. And he was from this area, Milwaukee. He grew up not far from here, actually. And he was a bit older than her. She dated, quite a few different guys, trying to meet them sometimes through these groups like Parents Without Partners or the Vagabond Ski Club, where there were widows and widowers and divorcees and people along those lines. And Fran was divorced. He was, a bit older than my mom, about 10 years older. He had children of his own. And, many of the guys that my mom dated over time, there was something off about them, and there's, I suppose, a whole story that can be told about this guy or that guy or this guy. I remember it was very hard to connect with and to click with them. And I think a lot of them felt like they needed to make an effort to do so because, you get in with the kids and then you get in with the mom. And my mom was very, vivacious and attractive. And so I think, they saw her as kind of a catch. Well, with Fran, he was very above board. You knew exactly what you were getting into. And if you thought that you were doing something wrong, he'd come out and tell you. But he wouldn't insist on it as if, his way or no way. He would just say, hey, you're screwing up, let's try it this way. And he was a really great mediating influence on my mom, who had some strange ideas occasionally. Nowadays I think we would look at her and say that she may have been manic. She did a lot of really good stuff, but there were some things where she was kind of off base. So I'll give you some examples. I remember that he talked her into finally getting me a new bike. I had actually done something really stupid. This was back when my dad was still alive. I had deliberately wrecked my bike because I was hoping that I would get a different kind of bike as a replacement, a BMX bike like the other kids on the block had. And, my dad said, well, you wrecked that bike, you're not getting another bike. So instead I skateboarded. And that's how I got very good at skateboarding when I was a kid. I was probably about 14 or so, maybe 13. No, I was 13. And Fran said, he saw me skateboarding around. He saw all the other kids with bikes. And he said, Monique, why doesn't Greg have a bike? And she went to he destroyed his bike, and I didn't actually destroy it, but I wrecked it up good enough. He doesn't know the value of those sort of things. She came from, pretty lower middle class background where you didn't, you took care of your stuff, understandable. But, she'd gone a little bit too far with it. He's like, come on, a kid needs a bike. As a matter of fact, now is a good time to don't get him a dirt bike, get him a 10-speed. Then he can get around to where he needs to go. Remember, I grew up out in the country, so having a 10-speed was a hell of a lot more useful than having a dirt bike in some parts. I mean, you couldn't ride on trails with it, but you could get from town to town with it, right? You'd ride on the highways, and there was actually, by that time, they're building trails, tearing up the railroad and putting in gravel trails that we would use, that I ended up using later on to get to my job in Waukesha. So there was that. And, freshman year, my mom was very much against me going to parties that girls were going to be present at. And Fran was like, he's a 14-year-old boy. You probably need to let the rope out a bit because otherwise he's going to break it. And he was right. And I didn't get myself in any sort of trouble other than catching mono from somebody who I dated, who was one of these people in Parents Without Partners. We took a trip to Florida, but there's a whole other story there. And so Fran was a great guy. He didn't try to be my dad, but he wound up in effect being another dad. And he wasn't a replacement. He was his own person. He's still alive, and one of the things that I'm really happy about is that he and I have reconnected in the last year or so and gotten to talk quite a bit. He got to meet my wife and my kids, and so we get to be part of each other's life again. We spent a lot of time actually out at Fran's house, which was in the Brookfield Elm Grove area. He had a pool, and so we'd go to pool parties, and it was a lot of fun. Other kids were there because he'd bring all these Parents Without Partners people, and I helped him out too with yard work sometimes, and that was good as well. So, I lost my dad, and then I had Fran in my life. And even after my mom and him broke up, he and I stayed in touch for a while. And so I was going to college, and sometimes I'd come back to town and look him up and go out. We'd go out for lunch or something and catch up. And that was really good. I was very fortunate to have him in my life. And to have him still back in my life now. So the third dad is actually the first dad, who didn't know that he was my dad, because there's a whole story there having to do with sort of hooking up during the summer of love, and then finding out that somebody was pregnant, my birth mother, with me. And, doing a lot of things to try to help her out and support her, and then getting a letter saying, he was never your kid. I was just trying to, in essence, scam you. My RA came up with that idea. And so, I got in touch with him in part because my doctor, I'm in my 40s, my doctor was saying, well, you know about your birth mother. What do you know about your birth father? What's the story? What's the family history with that? I said, I don't know. But I knew that she knew who he was, so I asked her, what's his name? And I had been sort of given a line about how they had met that was very different than what he would later on tell me, which I think is the true story. And so when I found out who my birth mother was, because she contacted me, I hadn't wanted to find out who my birth father was. But then, in my 40s, I'm tracking him down. And the first thing that he said to me is, well, you can't be my kid because, your mother said that you're not mine. Well, we did a genetic test, and sure enough, turns out that I am. And, I have a half brother and a half sister. All of us resemble each other in very important ways, like what we like to do, down to physical things like my half-sister tells me that me and Carl, my father, cough the same way, when we're clearing our throat. And it's just been it's been a great time getting to know all of them, and getting to spend some time and interact with them. It's tough because 45 years passed that some of which could have been used to get to know each other when we were younger. I think it probably would have been quite useful for me to have had Carl in my life as I, made some major decisions and had my kids, and eventually, my first marriage, decided to end it and divorce. It would have been great to have that kind of support and guidance there, but that's the way things turn out sometimes. But he is in my life now, and we have hopefully decades left together to get to know each other and spend time together and deepen our relationship. And getting to know him has been, I'm not sure what the right words for it is, very, very fulfilling. When you're adopted, this is the case with a lot of adopted children, even if your family that you're adopted into is really good. And I, my family was pretty good. I lucked out, especially when I compare myself with other kids who I know who are adopted who didn't wind up with adoptive parents who were loving or competent or, trying to instill some good values in them, or supportive at the right times. Even with that, there's something kind of missing, and you're not quite sure what it is. And to connect up with and build a relationship with my birth father, to allow him the space to grow into being my father and me to be his son, that fills something. I don't really know how better to describe it. And all three of these men are in some respects quite different from each other. I would say that they all have some things in common. They were all pretty, old school when it came to a lot of things like providing for your family and dealing with issues as they come up. All of them are or have been good influences in my life. So I think I'm extraordinarily fortunate to be able to say that I have three dads. A lot of people get just one dad, and sometimes that's not a particularly good dad. I've had three good dads, and so I got, in some respects, more than my fair share. But it's been enough at the right point in time. None of these guys actually have met each other because they didn't cross paths at those points in time. But there it is. Viewers have been asking me to do more of these personally oriented videos, and this is something I've been thinking about for quite some time, the notion of having multiple fathers, especially as I think about myself as a father and how I want to live my life and deal with my own children and pass things on. So that's pretty much all I have to say on the topic. I mean, there's plenty of stories that I could tell and much more I could say about these guys, but I think that's a good place to end it.